Chapter 36 Sri Muruganar. Muruganar's devotion for Bhagavan was so strong that he acquired the nickname Bhagavan's Shadow. He has composed innumerable poems in praise of Bhagavan's infinite grace and power. Muruganar's poetry is notable not only for its beauty of expression but also for the depth of feeling. Muruganar was born in August 1890 in Ramanaantham district of Tamil Nadu. His father was Krishna Iyer and his mother was Subbulakshmi Ammal. He had a sister named Kamakshi. Krishna Iyer passed away when his son was just a young boy. Muruganar's actual name was Subramanian. He was called Sambamurthy at home. For the first 5 years of his life, the child did not utter a single word. Maybe he was saving all his speech to be poured forth in a torrent of exquisite poetry in his later life. Muruganar attended the Christian mission school in Ramanaantham. After passing the 10th standard, he went to Madurai and stayed with a relative for 2 years, completed his matriculation and returned home. Upon his return to Ramanaantham, Muruganar was approached by one Veluswami Thevar, a member of the royal family, with a request to teach him the Tirukkural. The entire family had a deep love for the Tamil language. When they came to know about Muruganar's ability as a teacher, many members of the family approached him for the clarification of their doubts. As a result of his association with them, Muruganar gained the respect and good wishes of the royal family. At that time, the renowned Tamil scholar Rao Sahib Mu. was a court poet of the royal court of Ramanaantham. There was another great poet in the same court, and by a strange coincidence, he was also called Raghavaiyangar. With the patronage of the royal family, these two poets made a significant contribution to Tamil literature. Thanks to his association with the royal family, Muruganar had the opportunity to work with these great scholars. Muruganar joined some other scholars in making a critical study of the 5 great Tamil classics, namely Silapadikaram, Mani Mekalai, Sivaka Chintamani, Valayapati and Kundalakesi. This was followed by research into other Tamil literary works like Tirukkural, Nannul and Naishadam. Muruganar had a specifically remarkable understanding of Tiruvalluvar's immortal work Tirukkural. Several of the Tamil scholars of the day had joined to compile a Tamil dictionary. Muruganar was one of the members of the committee. As a result of his involvement in this project, Muruganar had the opportunity to work closely with great scholars like Rao Sahib Mu. Raghavaiyangar, Mahamahopadhyaya Dr. U.V. Swaminatha Iyer, Rao Bahadur V.S. Sengalvaraya Pillai, and Sri Sachidanandam Pillai, etc. All these scholars had a great regard for Muruganar. It was this group of scholars that wrote the special preface for Muruganar's book Sri Ramana Sannidhi Murai. Rao Sahib Raghavaiyangar had a special affection and regard for Muruganar. It was he who persuaded Muruganar to take up the job of Tamil teacher in the Norvik High School for Girls in Madras. While he was working in Madras, Muruganar's wife Meenakshi and his mother were staying with him. Muruganar's father-in-law Dandapani Swami was a devotee of Bhagavan. On one of his visits to Madras, Dandapani Swami gave Bhagavan's Arunachala Stuti Panchakam and Who Am I to his son-in-law and asked him to read the books. Muruganar was captivated by these 2 books, which are treasure houses of devotion and philosophy. Upon reading the books, Muruganar developed the desire to go to Tiruvannamalai and have darshan of Sri Ramana Maharshi, but the pressures of work made it impossible for him to go at once. During the midterm holidays in September, Muruganar was determined to make a visit to Ramanashram. With God's grace, he was able to put his plans into action immediately and he reached Tiruvannamalai on the 21st of September 1923. Upon reaching Tiruvannamalai, Muruganar saw the tall towers of the Arunachala temple and went in. He stood in front of the shrine of Lord Arunachaleswara and his divine consort, lost in adoration. It was an extremely thrilling experience for him. His excitement reached an even higher pitch when he thought of the visit to Ramanashram. He suddenly realized that he had not brought any offerings to lay at the Maharshi's feet. Immediately, he sat down and wrote a decade of verses in praise of Bhagavan. This poem, titled Desigapadikam, was to be Muruganar's first offering to his master. With his offering, Muruganar hastened to Ramanashramam and was soon standing in front of Bhagavan, drinking in his form with brimming eyes and a heart overflowing with joy. Bhagavan showered his grace upon this unique devotee in his own way, with a silent yet eloquent gaze. That evening, Muruganar joined the others for dinner. After dinner, all the devotees were sitting in Bhagavan's presence. Muruganar suddenly got up, prostrated to Bhagavan and rushed out. Seeing that Muruganar appeared greatly agitated, Bhagavan signaled to Kunjaswami and Arunachalaswami to follow Muruganar. Soon, Muruganar and the two others were on the bank of the Agni Tirtham. Muruganar did not seem to have any intentions of slackening his speed. Kunjaswami approached the hurrying form in front of him and gently suggested, "Sir, the moon is shining brightly and the night is cool and beautiful. Why don't we sit on these steps and relax for a while?" Muruganar responded to this suggestion and sat down on the steps with his two new friends. At first, he was silent, but soon he started talking about the strange experience that made him rush out of the ashram. He said that he had suddenly felt an overpowering excitement that was frightening in its intensity, and that this sudden rush of emotion was too much for him to handle, and so he had decided to return home immediately. To calm him and to reassure him, they started talking about Bhagavan's infinite compassion, the concern and kindness he showered on his devotees, as also the all-encompassing love that Bhagavan gave to every creature, animal and human alike. Gradually, Muruganar calmed down, went back to the ashram with his friends and stayed for 2 days. After that, he often came to Tiruvannamalai and stayed in the ashram for 2 or 3 days each time. Ever since his first darshan of Bhagavan, Muruganar was totally won over by him, and he lost interest in everything else. Muruganar was a staunch Gandhian and wore only khadi garments. As he believed in the principle of ahimsa or non-violence, he would not travel in vehicles drawn by horses or bulls. He therefore walked to the ashram all the way from the railway station in Tiruvannamalai town. Muruganar was totally captivated by Bhagavan and could not stay away from Bhagavan and Ramanashramam for long. Every time he felt the urge to see Bhagavan, he would immediately catch the train and come to the ashram. When it was time to return to Madras, he just could not bear to leave Bhagavan. He would somehow force himself to leave the ashram and would set off for the railway station. But in a short while, he would move back in the ashram. With his characteristic perception, Bhagavan understood Muruganar's difficulty and arranged for someone to go with Muruganar just to make sure he reached the station. Someone would accompany Muruganar to the station. Once his companion had left him, however, Muruganar would completely forget the reason for his being in the railway station. He would wander up and down the platform, oblivious to all the activity around him. The train would arrive and then leave amidst the ringing of bells and the blowing of whistles. Muruganar would not notice all the noise and the bustle, but would continue walking up and down, lost in thoughts of Sri Bhagavan. Long after the train had left, Muruganar would suddenly emerge from his reverie. He would look around in obvious confusion and after a few minutes would make his way back to the ashram. Upon his return to the ashram, Bhagavan would ask Muruganar, "Didn't the train come on time?" When he heard that the train had arrived on time, Bhagavan would ask, "Then why did you not board the train?" In a dazed tone of voice, Muruganar would reply, "I just didn't feel like getting into the train, Bhagavan." The next time Muruganar made preparations for going to Madras, Bhagavan would make it a point to send someone with him to see that Muruganar actually boarded the train. In this fashion, Muruganar carried on with his life, travelling between Madras and Tiruvannamalai at frequent intervals. He wanted to wind up the household in Madras and settle down in Tiruvannamalai, but circumstances were not favourable. His mother was old and infirm, and Muruganar had to stay in Madras for her sake. In 3 years' time, Muruganar's mother passed away. He performed the last rites as prescribed. He took his mother's ashes to Dhanushkoti and dissolved a major portion of it in the sea there. Then, with the balance of his mother's ashes in an urn, Muruganar came to Tiruvannamalai. He placed the urn at the foot of a tree, had his bath, and went into the hall. When Bhagavan saw Muruganar, he inquired with touching concern, "Were you able to complete the last rites for your mother without any trouble?" Bhagavan's gentle tone and compassionate words shattered Muruganar's composure, and he broke down completely. Kunjaswami, who was nearby, said to Bhagavan, "Muruganar has brought his mother's ashes in an urn." Bhagavan said, "That is good. The Agni Tirtham is a suitable spot for dissolving the ashes." Muruganar took Bhagavan's advice and dissolved the ashes in the Agni Tirtham. After his mother's passing away, Muruganar resigned his job in Madras, wound up the household there, and came to Tiruvannamalai for good in 1926. At first, he stayed in the Palakuttu. He lived on alms, going into the town to beg every morning. On several occasions, he went without food for the entire day because he had missed the trip into town. Bhagavan used to say that by begging for one's food, one can easily conquer the ego. Muruganar's faith in this principle was very strong. Every morning he would set off on his rounds with a white towel in which he collected the food he received as alms. Then he would come to Palakuttu, lay the bundle of food on the bank of the pond, and wade into the water to clean his hands and feet. Muruganar was very fastidious when it came to personal hygiene. He would scrub his hands and legs with mud several times till he was satisfied that they were quite clean. Naturally, this took a lot of time. The monkeys in the area would come and devour all the food that Muruganar had collected. Finally, when he came out of the water, he would find that all his food was gone. He had no choice but to go without food that day. Sabhabadi Pillai, who was in charge of the Vinayaka temple in Palakuttu, once saw the monkeys plundering Muruganar's food. Out of concern for the hapless Muruganar, Sabhabadi Pillai offered to stay within the temple premises and asked Muruganar to stay in his room. During the time of Muruganar's stay in Palakuttu, Kunjaswami, Moonagala Venkatrama Iyer, Viswanatha Swami, Ramanatha Brahmachari and Ramasubba Iyer were also staying there. All of them being Bhagavan's staunch devotees, they enjoyed each other's company greatly. Kunjaswami often spoke of those days with a lot of nostalgic feeling. Of all Bhagavan's devotees, Muruganar and Pudukkottai K. Lakshmana Sharma were privileged to learn the scriptures directly from Bhagavan. Natesa Swami, the head of the Isanya Mutt, had heard about Muruganar's capabilities as a teacher. He therefore requested Muruganar to stay in the mutt and teach him Manika Vachakar's Tiruchittrambala Kovai. Accordingly, Muruganar went to stay in the Isanya Mutt. Every morning he would take class for Natesa Swami, and in the afternoon he would come to Ramanashramam. In those days, Sadhu Natanananda was staying in the Guhai Namachivaya Mutt on the Arunachala hill. Natanananda would time his own visit to Ramanashramam in such a way that he would meet Muruganar near the western tower of Arunachaleswara temple every afternoon. From this spot, both of them would walk to Ramanashramam together. Muruganar used to compose some verses and bring them along every day. During their walk, the two friends would discuss Muruganar's latest composition. One day, it so happened that Muruganar was able to compose only the first 4 lines of a verse. Try as he might, he could not complete the verse. Natanananda read the 4 lines and wrote another 4 lines, thus completing the verse. When they reached the ashram, they showed the poem to Bhagavan and told him the story behind it. Bhagavan smiled at Natanananda and said, "Tomorrow You should write the first 4 lines of a poem and get Muruganar to complete the verse for you. Natanananda did just that, and the second poem was also shown to Bhagavan. After reading the poem, Bhagavan said, "Good! It looks like we have twin poets here. You should name the first poem Muruga Natana and the second one Natana Muruga." Everyone present was very much entertained by this amazing incident. In addition to practicing self-inquiry prescribed by Bhagavan, his devotees also gave a lot of importance to Giri Pradakshinam. Giri Pradakshinam is a potent way of attaining self-realization. Muruganar performed Giri Pradakshinam for 48 consecutive days. During Pradakshina, between the Nirdi Lingam and Adiammal, he had no body consciousness. From 1923 to 1973, that is for half a century, Muruganar has poured forth his love and reverence for Bhagavan in thousands of beautiful poems. Sri Ramana Sannidhi Murai contains 1851 poems in praise of Bhagavan. Every one of the poems in this book is a rare combination of literary perfection and heartfelt emotion. In addition to Sri Ramana Sannidhi Murai, Muruganar has composed Sri Ramana Devamalai, Sri Ramana Charana Pallandu, Sri Ramana Anubhuti, Sri Ramana Alankaram, and Sri Ramana Jnanabodham. The collection of Bhagavan's teachings by Muruganar, titled Guru Vachaka Kovai, has the distinction of being edited by Bhagavan himself. In addition to all this, Muruganar has written a very detailed commentary for Bhagavan's Aksharamanammalai. In the first few months of his stay in Tiruvannamalai, Muruganar resided in Palakuttu. Afterwards, in response to the request of Dr. T.N. Krishnaswamy Iyer of Madras, Muruganar came to stay in his building opposite to Ramanashram. Padma and I were also tenants in the same building. It was while we were all in the same premises that Muruganar started teaching me and Padma the Nool Thirattu of Bhagavan and the scriptures. Padma and I did our best to be of assistance to Muruganar. In 1971, Muruganar was shifted to the room near the Ashram dispensary as his health was deteriorating. The ashram took up the responsibility of providing for all his needs like food and medical care. In spite of the best treatment and attention, however, Muruganar's condition worsened, and on the 28th of August 1973, Muruganar left this world. His mortal remains have been enshrined at the foot of the hill within the ashram premises. Every year, devotees perform special puja in memory of this great devotee of Bhagavan. Now let us read some more incidents connected with Muruganar. Chapter 37. The Master Who Devours Everything. One of the advantages we enjoyed was that we could benefit from Bhagavan's conversations with various people. Someone or the other would ask a question. Bhagavan's answers were always short and to the point. Yet, Bhagavan's words seemed to be addressed directly and personally to every member in the gathering. Sometimes, a devotee would have a doubt or a problem which he was reluctant to discuss in the presence of strangers. In such situations, somebody else would ask Bhagavan a question, and Bhagavan's reply would answer the reticent devotee's unasked question too. This is indeed the greatest miracle of all. Once, a devotee of Vilakshanananda Swami visited Sri Ramanashram. He approached Bhagavan and timidly inquired, "Our Guru tells us to repeat the name of the Lord a fixed number of times every day and surrender to him the spiritual merit thus acquired. What is the practice here?" Bhagavan laughed heartily at the cleverness of the Guru who accumulated vast spiritual wealth without having to work for it. When Muruganar entered the hall, Bhagavan beckoned him and said, "Look, isn't this a marvelous idea? This person's Guru tells all his disciples to do Namajapa or recitation of the name so many times every day and collects the spiritual merit as his due. I wonder what the disciples get after this surrender. This is like paying out regular installments of interest on a loan, isn't it? How do you like the idea?" Muruganar replied, O Bhagavan, dear Guru is certainly far better than you. He only demands the interest, leaving the principle intact. But you swallow up everything, principle, interest and all. When the individual himself has disappeared, who is there to repay the loan? And anyway, the principle and the interest also get wiped out. Nothing at all remains. As he spoke, Muruganar's eyes filled with tears and his voice was choked with emotion. Bhagavan merely smiled and remained silent. What Muruganar meant was that Bhagavan wipes out the mind and the ego of his devotees. Once the mind has disappeared without trace, where is the instrument for doing japa or meditation? The mind is the principle that has been loaned to us for this lifetime, and nama japa is the interest to be paid on this principle. How can one pay the interest when the principle itself has disappeared? The destruction of the principle or the mind or ego is a matter for rejoicing. When Bhagavan confiscates the principle, that is, when his glance of grace destroys the mind, the fortunate devotee is forever free of his liabilities. He no longer has to worry about paying interest in the form of japa, etc. The destruction of the principle, therefore, brings great joy. Chapter 38. Avvaiyar's Poetic Skill. Tiruvalluvar was one of the greatest of Tamil poets. In his immortal Tirukkural, he has recorded the wisdom of the ages. The greatness of the Tirukkural lies in the fact that the highest philosophical truths and the most pragmatic advice about everyday life and values have been presented in pithy verses, each verse being no more than 1 3¼ lines in length. Once, Bhagavan's devotees were discussing Tiruvalluvar's skill in condensing the greatest truths into the shortest of verses. Someone mentioned that Idaikadar, one of the famous poets of the Sangam age, had composed a verse in praise of Tiruvalluvar's unique ability. Idaikadar says, "So much wisdom has been condensed into such compact verses that it seems as though Tiruvalluvar has drilled a hole in a single mustard seed and filled it with all the waters of the 7 seas." Bhagavan, who was listening to this discussion, turned to Muruganar and said, "Hasn't Avvaiyar condensed the Kural even further?" To this query, Muruganar replied, "Yes, indeed. Avvaiyar has composed a poem of amazing brevity and unmatched beauty. It is an interesting story. Once, a group of poets were discussing the greatness of Tiruvalluvar and the unique nature of the Tirukkural. Avvaiyar was asked to give her opinion. She said, "All of you seem to be highly impressed by the so-called brevity of the Tirukkural. But is it really so very concise and compact? Can a collection of 1330 couplets divided into 133 chapters be thought of as being brief or concise? I cannot see the need for so many verses just to tell us about virtue, wealth, and happiness. In my opinion, the Tirukkural is an unnecessarily long composition." The other poets were taken aback by Avvaiyar's words. They did not believe that the matter in the Tirukkural could possibly be condensed any further. So they challenged Avvaiyar to compose a really short poem which could be considered equal to the Tirukkural in brevity, clarity, and beauty. Immediately, Avvaiyar responded with the following poem. "Charity is a supreme virtue. Wealth is that which is earned through lawful means. The happiness that is enjoyed by a loving couple through the union of minds is the only true happiness. The renunciation of virtue, wealth, and happiness in order to seek the supreme results in everlasting bliss." Muruganar said, "Whereas Valluvar had dealt with the 3 subjects of virtue, wealth, and happiness, Avvaiyar had included realization also in her 4-line poem. All the other poets were speechless with wonder. Bhagavan and his devotees too were full of appreciation for Avvaiyar's unique skill as a poet. This anecdote is certainly not known to many. It is doubtful whether even a scholar specializing in ancient Tamil literature would have heard about it. But to a devotee of Bhagavan, such precious pearls of wisdom are easy to come by. Such is the power of Bhagavan's presence. Chapter 39. Avial and Adiammal. Bhagavan was particular that no visitor to the ashram should go away hungry. At meal times, be it breakfast, lunch or dinner, Bhagavan always insisted that everybody should take food. If for some reason someone happened to miss a meal, Bhagavan used to feel bad about it. If he noticed that someone was absent at mealtime, he would personally check upon that person and see to it that he had something to eat. Adiammal was a lady from Nellore who had great devotion for Bhagavan. She was a frequent visitor to the ashram and often made liberal donations towards its upkeep. This lady was a close friend of Varanasi Subbulakshmi Ammal, who was an assistant in the ashram kitchen. Adiammal was on one of her visits to the ashram. In the dining hall, she found herself almost directly opposite to Bhagavan's place. Bhagavan entered the hall and seated himself in his usual place. The attendants started serving the food. When everybody had been served, Bhagavan usually nodded his head as a signal for everyone to start. That particular day, when Bhagavan glanced around the hall, he saw Adiammal standing in front of her leaf plate. He gestured to her to sit down, saying, "Why are you standing? Please sit down and begin your meal." At once, Adiammal sat down. Adiammal was elated because Bhagavan had addressed her personally. The next day also she remained standing until Bhagavan noticed her and told her to sit down. The third day, Adiammal again stood in front of her plate, waiting for Bhagavan to notice her. She was hoping that he would address her personally as on the previous occasions. But this time, Bhagavan did not say anything at all. Adiammal continued to stand. Everybody else was busy eating. That day, some festival was being celebrated, and so, Avial, a special South Indian dish containing a variety of vegetables with curd, had been prepared. While serving the Avial on Bhagavan's leaf, Shantama said in a low voice, "Bhagavan, Adiammal is still standing. Will not Bhagavan ask her to sit down?" Bhagavan responded to this saying, "Oh, there is a Subbulakshmi Ammal to take care of Adiammal. But what about Muruganar? Who is there to take care of him? See, you have prepared Avial today. Has anyone thought of giving a portion of this special dish to Muruganar?" Shantamal was deeply touched by Bhagavan's loving concern for Muruganar. She said, "I will go right away and give Muruganar some of this Avial." She hurried into the kitchen, scooped up some Avial in a coconut shell and set off to Palakuttu in search of Muruganar. By the time Shantamma left the ashram with Avial in her hand, Muruganar had left Palakuttu and started out to ask for alms. He had just reached the Dakshinamurti temple opposite the Morvi guest house when Shantamal saw him. She hurried after him, calling, "Sambamurti, Sambamurti!" Shantamal and Muruganar had been neighbors in their childhood, and so she always called him Sambamurti, which was his childhood name. On hearing Shantamal's voice, Muruganar looked around, and seeing her hurrying towards him, he stood still and waited for her. By the time she reached him, poor Shantamal was out of breath. She gasped, "A fine person you are, wandering around like a madman while Bhagavan is so concerned about you. Why don't you come to the ashram and have your meals with the rest of the devotees?" She proceeded to relate the details of the incident in the dining hall. Muruganar was stunned. He was overcome by emotion when he heard about Bhagavan's concern for his welfare. He kept repeating, "Did Bhagavan say that? Was he worried about me? Did he say, 'Who will take care of Muruganar?' Such concern for me. How fortunate I am." His voice grew hoarse and his eyes filled with tears His face was flushed with emotion. Unable to support his frame, he simply sat on the steps of the temple. He raised the coconut shell to his eyes and reverently poured the avial into his cupped palms and ate it as Bhagavan's sacred Mahaprasad. He decided not to proceed with his bhiksha that day. His heart was so full that it mattered little that his stomach was far from full. Bhagavan's love and concern for Muruganar was wonderful indeed. Chapter 40. Ramanaantham. Once, a scholar from the Kovilur Mutt came to see Muruganar. He had a good knowledge of both the scriptures and the literary works in Tamil. He had heard about Muruganar's poetic genius and had come to Tiruvannamalai especially to meet him. Muruganar had stayed in the Kovilur Mutt for some time and he knew the head of the Mutt quite well. Muruganar and the head of the Kovilur Mutt had a lot of regard for each other. So, upon the scholar's arrival at Ramanashram, Muruganar spent some time making enquiries about his old acquaintances in the mutt. After a while, the conversation changed to literary and philosophical works. The visitor wanted to know about Bhagavan's teachings, both the written works and the answers to the questions posed by devotees. Muruganar gave him the information he sought, and the visitor was amazed at the efficacy and the freshness of Bhagavan's teachings. Soon afterwards, the visitor left on a Giri Pradakshinam. He returned to the ashram in the afternoon. At that time, Muruganar was explaining to me Odivil Odukkam. The visitor from the Kovilur Mutt sat with us and listened attentively to Sri Muruganar's words. The written commentary to the Odivil Odukkam was based on the philosophical interpretations of the work. Muruganar would explain the collected works of Bhagavan. Then he would illustrate the same point by telling me about some incident or remark made by Bhagavan. At the end of the lesson, the visitor asked Muruganar, "Sir, please tell me one thing. Are your explanations based on Siddhanta or Vedanta?" Muruganar was rather surprised by this question. Obviously, he had never considered the matter. After a few moments of thought, he said, "I know neither Siddhanta nor Vedanta. All I know is Bhagavan and the truth as he has taught it to me. So maybe the best description for my interpretation would be Ramanaantham." The visitor could see that Muruganar was in a highly emotional state, so he refrained from asking any further questions. Normally, commentaries are classified into Vedanta Param and Siddhanta Param. Bhagavan based his teachings on his own experience of the truth and needed no corroboration from either the scriptural or the philosophical texts. Bhagavan's emphasis on self-inquiry can be considered a revolutionary approach to the search for the eternal truth. If Bhagavan is to be considered a revolutionary teacher, Muruganar certainly deserves to be known as the revolutionary disciple. Who but an exceptional disciple could have coined the term Ramanaantham to describe Ramana's way? Sadguru Tyagaraja's musical compositions are known to the music world as Tyagopanishad, the Upanishad of Tyagaraja. In the same way, Bhagavan's devotees revere their master's teachings as Ramanopanishad or Ramanaantham. Chapter 41. Saraswati Puja. The Navaratri festival is celebrated at the Matrabodheshwara temple at Ramanashram. This festival is dedicated to the Mother Goddess in her various manifestations. It is a 9-day festival, and the 9th day is celebrated as Saraswati Puja, or the worship of Goddess Saraswati. On this day, the traditional practice is to offer worship to books. True to tradition, some books had been arranged on a stool placed beside Bhagavan's sofa. Muruganar entered the hall and, seeing the pile of books with flowers strewn over them, was quite amused. He gave Bhagavan an eloquent look and received an enigmatic smile in reply. No words were required. The communication between them was perfect and total. Muruganar could not understand the need for any symbols of divinity when God himself was seated in the hall. That is why the worship of books in Bhagavan's presence struck him as being superfluous. In lines 321 and 322 of the Ramana Puranam, Muruganar says, "All ancient texts and the expositions put together can be no more than a preface to the book of your powerful silence." He was amused by the idea of worshipping a pile of books in the very presence of the repository of all knowledge, Bhagavan Sri Ramana Maharshi. Muruganar expressed his feelings in the form of a very beautiful poem which he wrote on a piece of paper and handed to Bhagavan. "Bhagavan, this idea of placing books beside your sofa and worshipping them with due reverence is like placing the chaff of sugar cane beside sugar candy. You are the sweet personification of perfection, O Bhagavan. These books are like the crushed sugar cane from which all the juice has been extracted. Of what value is the crushed sugar cane waste when one has the beautiful sugar figurine in one's possession? You are the personification of the essence of all the knowledge contained in all the scriptures. When you are here with us, can these books have any real value? Maybe these books deserve to be worshipped after all. It could be that the crushed sugar cane considers itself worthy of respect because it is in the sugar cane that the sugar idol originated. It seems to me that the sugar cane might expect some recognition for this fact and has asked to be worshipped for this reason." Bhagavan read this poem with a smile. At the end, he looked at Muruganar and nodded his head in appreciation of the views expressed in the poem. Muruganar later remarked to some friends that the incident struck him as being as inexplicable as wanting to worship a portrait of Bhagavan in the very presence of Bhagavan himself. An incident occurred a few days later. A new visitor to the ashram was telling Bhagavan that he had been worshipping Lord Subramanya with great devotion for 10 years, but the Lord has not chosen to appear before him. The devotee was obviously in anguish and might have expected Bhagavan to give him some advice. But Bhagavan merely nodded his head and said, "Is that so?" Muruganar, who was sitting in the hall, became emotional and said to the devotee, "Sir, your prayers have been effective indeed. Look before you. Who is this in front of your eyes?" The devotee opened his eyes wide and gazed at Bhagavan. Within moments, his eyes filled with tears of ecstasy, and he exulted, "Yes, my prayers have been granted. My Subramanya is right here. I am fortunate indeed." Later in the evening, this devotee went to Muruganar and told him, "Thank you, sir, for directing me. I looked at Bhagavan and saw Lord Subramanya with his two consorts. Bhagavan Sri Ramana is none other than Lord Subramanya." Several devotees have reported similar incidents, that is, seeing Bhagavan as the manifestation of their own favorite deities. Muruganar, for his part, sang the glory of Sri Bhagavan as the manifestation of all the gods. Chapter 42. The Unskilled Artisan. In the early days, before Ramanashram was established, Bhagavan's devotees used to enjoy certain privileges which were denied to them later. For example, it was possible for the devotees to obtain the leaf plate which Bhagavan had used and to eat from it themselves, thus getting the satisfaction of enjoying a very intimate relationship with their master. In those days, Bhagavan used to wash his hands in a basin. Devotees vied with each other to obtain this water which was considered sacred prasad. Devotees also enjoyed the privilege of collecting the water with which Bhagavan had washed his feet and sprinkling it on their own heads as benediction. Bhagavan never encouraged such practices. The devotees were able to indulge in such activities because Bhagavan was unaware of what was going on. When the devotees started doing all this blatantly, and especially when they started competing with each other for these privileges, Bhagavan firmly put a stop to such practices. There was a secret agreement among the ashram attendants, according to which they took turns eating from the leaf plate Bhagavan had used during lunch and dinner. These arrangements were kept a closely guarded secret. Somehow, Muruganar came to know that such a thing was going on, and he developed the desire to enjoy this rare privilege at least once. Accordingly, Muruganar entered the dining hall one day after Bhagavan had finished his lunch. He was hesitating at the entrance, wondering whom to approach and how to obtain Bhagavan's leaf plate, when he saw Shantamal in the dining hall. Muruganar and Shantamal were from the same town, Ramanaantham, and had known each other from childhood. So Muruganar thought that his task would become easy. On hearing Muruganar's wish, Shantamal told him that in the daytime it was only the attendants who took Bhagavan's leave, and that Muruganar would have to wait till dinner time for a chance to obtain Bhagavan's leaf plate. Mudaliyar grandma used to send food at lunchtime for Bhagavan. As he belonged to a higher caste, Shantamal thought that Muruganar was not supposed to take the leaf plate used during lunch. Muruganar was badly disappointed. Usually, he never nurtured a desire for anything. His one desire of obtaining Bhagavan's leaf plate had proved futile. So he poured forth his feelings in the form of a verse. Lord Brahma, the creator of the universe, is very good at chanting all the 4 Vedas. But when it comes to fashionable, suitable dwellings for all the souls entering the world, he is obviously incompetent. Let us consider my case. I have the body of a man. Maybe my actions in previous lives had entitled me to a human body. But the soul that resides in this body is undoubtedly that of a dog. That is why I have developed the desire to eat from your used plate. O noble Ramana, I prostrate myself at your feet and beg of you to grant me real knowledge. Chapter 43. Bhagavan and the Poet. There was an intimacy in the relationship between Muruganar and Bhagavan which was not obvious at first glance. Theirs was a relationship that did not require physical closeness. It was a union of mind and soul, far more intimate than words can describe. Muruganar's fidelity and single-minded devotion to Bhagavan was so strong that once he started singing in praise of Bhagavan, he refused to sing about any other god. He considered Bhagavan the only god and worshipped him alone. In his Puranthora Pattu, he says, Ramana, my lord, you are a teacher greater than any divine guru, and I will never feel the need to visit any other temple or worship any other god. He also categorically stated, I shall never worship at any shrine other than that of my Ramana. Muruganar was one of the greatest Tamil poets of this century. In fact, Thanigaimani Sengalvaraya Pillai said that Muruganar is to be considered an equal to any of the Tamil poets of the Sangam era, the period a few thousand years ago which is acknowledged as the golden age of Tamil poetry. Sengalvaraya Pillai has written a truly wonderful introduction to Muruganar's magnum opus, the Sri Ramana Sannidhi Murai. Mahapadhyaya U.V. Swaminatha Iyer has written a special preface to this same work. Muruganar's extraordinary poetic gifts became apparent while he was still very young. After his meeting with Bhagavan, his entire personality underwent a change. Not only did the pattern of his external life change, his spiritual awakening is also to be attributed to his meeting with Bhagavan. His poetry also acquired a new depth and poignancy after he came under Bhagavan's influence. Once he started singing Bhagavan's praises, Muruganar continued doing so for the rest of his life, dedicating poem after poem to his beloved master. Every thought and every nuance of feeling was recorded in immortal poetry and laid at Bhagavan's feet with the reverence of a devotee laying a wreath of flowers at the altar of his deity. The Aravars and Nayanmars of olden days have sung many songs glorifying the feet of the Lord. In the same vein, Muruganar has composed the Sri Ramanacharana Pallande in praise of Bhagavan's feet, which provide refuge and solace to all true devotees. The Ramana Sannidhi Murai begins with the phrase Namo Ramanaya, which is a potent mantra containing 6 syllables. The mantra for Lord Subramanya also consists of 6 syllables. This can be taken as corroboration of the theory that Bhagavan is an incarnation of Lord Subramanya. Muruganar believed that Bhagavan is the only God and that the devotee of Bhagavan need not go in search of any other deity. Once, a group of people made preparations for a pilgrimage. They came to Muruganar and asked him whether he would be interested in joining them. Muruganar replied, "The moment I set eyes on Bhagavan, who is the sun of self-awareness, my eyes became blinded by the brilliance of his form. Now I cannot see anything or anybody other than my Bhagavan. This being the case, of what use would a pilgrimage be for me?" In his Sri Ramana Sannidhi Murai, Muruganar has sung about Bhagavan in various different moods, extolling various facets of Bhagavan's greatness and of his own relationship with Bhagavan. Once he had come into Bhagavan's fold, Muruganar had no worldly ambitions or desires left. Everything had been surrendered to Bhagavan. However, Muruganar's love for Tamil and poetry refused to leave him. Muruganar himself ruefully acknowledges this in one verse. "O greatest of saints, I have surrendered my all to you. I have given up my desire for material possessions, for name, fame, and family ties, but I have not been able to give up my love for Tamil poetry. This, I admit, is a major flaw. However, I will attain peace by dedicating my poetry to the service of your lotus feet." Verse 1226. After coming to Bhagavan, Muruganar's fascination for Tirukkural also started fading. What had been almost an obsession now became a much milder admiration, and Muruganar felt relieved at the softening of his emotions. He expresses this relief in a verse in which he thanks Bhagavan for freeing him from the spell the Tirukkural and other literary works had cast upon him. In another poem, Muruganar says, "This peerless Brahmin, Ramana, who was born in Tiruchuri, has the power to change the destiny of his devotee. Though he himself had no formal instruction in the scriptures, his wisdom and knowledge are of such magnitude as to fill the most learned scholars with admiration. He shines as the sun of self-knowledge, bathing the world in the light of his grace." Sri Bhagavan attained self-realization at a very young age, without any austerities. Muruganar says in one of his poems, "Having obtained self-realization at a young age without having to take instructions from others or even having to make any conscious efforts, you are now bestowing the gift of self-knowledge upon your devotees through the power of your presence alone. Your devotees are fortunate indeed, for they are granted the highest of wisdom without having to undergo the rigors of spiritual exercises." It is common belief that yogis take birth in this world only to finish the process of spiritual evolution which had been left incomplete in previous lives. In one of Muruganar's poems, verse 1524, Tirucharal, a lady asks her friend, "If not to make up for the deficits of previous lives, why has this Venkatraman come down to earth now? Why else would he be walking about on this earth now?" To this, her friend replies, "Though it may appear as though Venkatraman, which is Bhagavan Ramana, is leading a mortal's life, the truth of the matter is that he is walking around on this earth barefooted only to satisfy the earth goddess's long-cherished desire to feel the touch of God's feet. Though God has come down to the earth in various incarnations, in each of these incarnations he has had various vehicles and his feet seldom touched the ground directly. So the earth goddess felt deprived of the privilege of touching the divine feet and was longing for a chance to do so. In response to her desire, God came into the world in the form of Sri Ramana and walked barefoot over every inch of the Arunachala hill just to please the goddess earth. All of us know that Bhagavan never wore any footwear. But Muruganar alone could have come up with such a beautifully moving explanation for Bhagavan's actions. Lord Shiva assumes human form to sport with his devotees. On one occasion, the Lord caused a terrible flood to wash away the banks of the river Vaigai. The Pandya king, faced with the task of rebuilding the banks, made it mandatory for each family to send one representative to help in the building the banks. A devout old lady, Vanti by name, found herself in a difficult position because she had nobody to send. Lord Shiva, in the form of a handsome youth, now appeared before Vanti and offered to go to work for her sake. As payment for the work, he demanded that Vanti should give him the pitte, which is a South Indian delicacy made with rice, coconut and jaggery that she was preparing. Though she had given him everything she had, Vanti must have regretted the fact that she could give only pitte to the Lord and must have longed for a chance to feed him with a variety of tasty dishes. It is this longing that resulted in Vanti appearing as 7 ladies and lovingly plying Ramana with a variety of dishes in the course of his walk through the forests around Arunachala hill. This captivating idea finds expression in one of Muruganar's lovely poems, verse 1651, verse 1651, Tiruppuvalli. The poem refers to an incident in Bhagavan's life. A detailed description of this incident can be found in Bhagavan's biography. Bhagavan had the power of bestowing self-knowledge on devotees through a mere glance of grace. Muruganar has devoted an entire chapter, T.R.Kanakammal, to the description of this unique aspect of Bhagavan's grace. One of the verses, verse 1613 in this chapter says, "Due to his constant absorption in the self, Sri Ramana is always in a state beyond sleep. Therefore, his eyes are always wide open, like the unblinking eyes of a fish swimming in a pool of clear water." If we are fortunate enough to encounter the unblinking gaze of Ramana, my friends, we can obtain all that we wish for. There is a beautiful song, verse 1507, in the section titled Tiruvannamalai, which says, a lady is asked, "Venkataramanan never bothers to address any words of welcome to those who come to see him. Yet, hordes of devotees rush to him every day with so much love and enthusiasm. Why should this be so, can you say?" To her friend's question, the lady replies, "The reason why multitudes of people flock to Sri Ramana with so much enthusiasm and joy is that there is an ocean of bliss flowing in front of the flower-soft feet of Ramana, and devotees are eager to immerse themselves in this ocean of joy." Bhagavan never asked anybody to come to him. Likewise, if someone wanted to leave the ashram, Bhagavan did not press them to stay on. At times, devotees would come to Bhagavan and tell him about the spiritual exercises that they were pursuing, or the books they were reading, or the method of meditation they were following. Bhagavan merely listened to all this, but never offered any criticism or encouragement. The most he ever said was, "Is that so?" That itself is enough. In spite of the fact that Bhagavan seldom uttered any words of instruction, devotees flocked to him because in his holy presence they found a peace and joy they could find nowhere else. It is to Muruganar that we owe the priceless gems of Bhagavan's spiritual teachings, especially Upadesa Undiyar and Ullathu Naarpadu. With Muruganar's repeated requests and untiring persuasion, Bhagavan recorded his teachings in these titles. They contain the very essence of the Vedas. Guru Vachaka Kovai, the garland of Guru's sayings by Muruganar, is also a collection of Sri Bhagavan's teachings. Muruganar attained great bliss through his association with Bhagavan. He acknowledges his debt to Bhagavan in one of the verses in Ramana Anubhuti, verse 33. I am like a bee feeding on the nectar flowing at the feet of Bhagavan Ramana, whose silence is the essence of the teaching that leads to the realization of the all-pervading power of Lord Shiva himself. It is because I am with Sri Ramana that my body, my life, and all my senses are constantly immersed in a state of supreme bliss. Muruganar's Ramana Anubhuti is a work full of praise for Bhagavan Ramana as a teacher and of Muruganar's gratitude for Bhagavan's grace. Chapter 44 Muruga-Mayavan. Muruganar's devotion for Bhagavan was beyond measure. All his love and devotion for Bhagavan found expression in the beautiful poems he composed in praise of Bhagavan. These poems had a sweetness and a depth of feeling that could not fail to melt the heart of listeners. Bhagavan's devotees used to sing some of Muruganar's poems in the hall so that everybody could enjoy the beauty of these captivating verses. Muruganar's wife, Meenakshi Ammal, was also a frequent visitor to the ashram. Bhagavan was always especially kind and considerate to this lady and treated her as a favored guest. Knowing that Meenakshi Ammal loved good coffee, Bhagavan would tell the ashram cooks, "Give Meenakshi good, strong coffee, just the way she likes it." Bhagavan would also listen patiently to Meenakshi Ammal's complaints about her husband, the chief among those being, of course, that Muruganar was neglecting her and all his domestic responsibilities. On one of her visits, Meenakshi Ammal seemed particularly upset. She told Bhagavan that Muruganar's neglect was very difficult for her to bear, and that Muruganar seemed not to realize just how badly his behavior was affecting her. It was Meenakshi Ammal's practice to sing a few verses from Muruganar's Ramana Sannidhi Murai in Bhagavan's presence every time she came to the ashram. On this occasion also, she had a copy of the book with her and was about to select some suitable chapter. Bhagavan took the book from her hands and marking the section where there was a decade of verses, each ending with Ramanamayavan, he said to Meenakshi Ammal, "Look, Meenakshi, Muruganar will soon be returning from Palakuttu. As soon as he enters the hall, you must start singing these verses. But remember one thing, each of these verses ends with the phrase Ramanamayavan. You must substitute Muruga-Mayavan for Ramanamayavan when you sing. Is that clear? Now, take your place and get ready, for Muruganar will be here soon." Meenakshi Ammal was a simple soul and her faith in Bhagavan was total. So she agreed to do exactly as Bhagavan said, even though she had no idea why he should want her to do it. Now, the verses selected by Bhagavan were very well suited to the occasion, because they presented the picture of a lovelorn lady chiding her lover for his cruel neglect. In these verses, Muruganar portrays himself as a lovelorn lady and entreats Bhagavan to favor him with his grace. To be precise, the lady describes the happy times she had shared with her Lord and the promises that he had made to her. Having won her with sweet words of love and assurances of undying devotion, her Lord had left her to dream about him and to wait eagerly for the time when he would come to claim her, but he had not come back. The lady chides her lover for his shameful neglect and asks him what she had done to deserve such cruel treatment from him. She bemoans her fate, regretting the fact that she had lost her heart to one so inconsistent, beguiled by his charm and his false promises. Each of the verses ends with the phrase Ramanamayavan. The term Mayavan can be translated as the great deluder. The lady is accusing her lover of misleading her with false promises. Yet, her language is far from abusive. In fact, her words are full of affection and reflect the remembered joy of happier times. Each of the poems in this section is exquisite in the beauty of expression and the delicacy of feeling. As soon as Muruganar entered the hall, Meenakshi Ammal started singing the songs selected by Bhagavan. Following Bhagavan's instructions faithfully, she ended each verse with Muruga-Mayavan instead of the original Ramana-Mayavan. The first time, Muruganar did not attach much importance to the substitution. Many devotees regard Bhagavan as an incarnation of Lord Muruga, and Muruganar simply assumed that Meenakshi Ammal was making a reference to this aspect of Bhagavan's multifaceted glory. When Meenakshi Ammal came to the end of the second verse and there was still no response from Muruganar, Bhagavan glanced at him with eyes full of mischief. Then he directed a look of approval and encouragement at Meenakshi Ammal. Suddenly, Muruganar realized that some conspiracy was at work. By then, Meenakshi Ammal had ended the third verse also with Muruga-Mayavan. This repeated substitution of Muruga-Mayavan for Ramana-Mayavan now appeared highly significant to Muruganar. He was finally convinced that Bhagavan was deliberately teasing him using Meenakshi Ammal as an innocent yet effective agent. Muruganar could think of only one course of action: escape. Accordingly, he got up and was preparing to quietly slip out of the hall when Bhagavan stopped him with, "Hey, why are you leaving the hall now? Is it not because she sang about her Muruga-Mayavan? Well, does that mean that whenever somebody sings about Ramana-Mayavan, I should immediately walk out of the hall? Is that not so?" Hearing Bhagavan's words, the entire hall dissolved in laughter. Muruganar made use of this diversion to make good his escape. Bhagavan often played such practical jokes upon his devotees. But even while he was engaged in such apparently playful activities, Bhagavan continued to impart valuable knowledge to his devotees. Every joke and every little trick had its own lesson to teach. On one occasion, Muruganar was distributing prasad to the devotees in the hall. Meenakshi Ammal was also in the hall at the time, but she did not receive any of the prasad. After giving the prasad to everyone in the hall, Muruganar went off to the office to distribute it among the devotees who were there. As soon as Muruganar left the hall, Meenakshi Ammal went to Bhagavan and complained, "Bhagavan, my husband gave prasad to everyone else, but he did not give any to me." When Muruganar returned to the hall, Bhagavan took him to task, saying, "What is the matter? Why did you not give any prasad to Meenakshi?" Muruganar answered, "While I was distributing the prasad, everyone held out their hands, and I just placed a little of the prasad in each outstretched hand. Meenakshi did not hold out her hand. So it is her own fault that she did not receive the prasad." Bhagavan now turned to Meenakshi Ammal and asked her, "Meenakshi, did you not hold out your hand like everybody else? Why did you not do so?" Meenakshi Ammal had no reply. The fact was that she had deliberately refrained from holding out her hand, hoping that her husband would notice and ask her to hold out her hand for the prasad. But Muruganar was not prepared to show her any special favor and had calmly walked past her. Offended by her husband's coolness, Meenakshi Ammal had then complained to Bhagavan, hoping that Bhagavan would reprimand Muruganar for his negligence. But Muruganar nearly turned the tables on her, thereby leaving her speechless. Muruganar's love for Bhagavan was so great that whenever he sat before Bhagavan in the hall, he would keep gazing at him with wide-eyed wonder. His mouth too would remain agape, as though he were trying to absorb Bhagavan's enchanting form through every one of his senses. Chapter 45. Farewell to Rituals. In the early days of his life at Ramanashram, Muruganar used to perform the ritualistic ceremonies prescribed for the death anniversaries of his parents. Once, on the day of his mother's anniversary, Muruganar came to the kitchen very early in the morning. He washed his dhoti and hung it up to dry. Then, with the wet towel around his waist, he set about getting the vegetables ready. While Muruganar was thus engaged, Bhagavan entered the kitchen. One glance at the dhoti drying on the clothesline and the sight of Muruganar clad in a wet towel told Bhagavan everything. He said to Muruganar, "It is your mother's annual ceremony today, is it not? Have you made all arrangements? Who are the Brahmins?" Before Muruganar could reply, Bhagavan himself continued. Tapping himself on the chest, Bhagavan said, "I can be one of the Brahmins. We need one more. I think we can have Rangarao as a second Brahmin. Will that be all right?" Muruganar knew well that Bhagavan did not consider rituals important. Yet, here he was, making arrangements for the ceremony Muruganar had to perform that day, planning even the smallest details. Muruganar felt so moved that he could hardly keep himself from breaking down completely. Muruganar felt that, at the very instant that Bhagavan tapped his own chest and said, "I will be one of the Brahmins for the ceremony," not only his parents but several generations of ancestors would have attained liberation. Muruganar never again felt it necessary to perform the annual ceremony for his parents. Though Muruganar stopped performing the ceremony on the next death anniversary of his mother, he brought a large jackfruit with the intention of giving some fruit to everyone in the ashram in memory of his mother. Bhagavan saw Muruganar with the jackfruit and remarked, "It is your mother's anniversary, is it not? I see you have not yet managed to get rid of these sentimental attachments." Hearing this, Muruganar exclaimed, "I will never do such a thing again." Even belief in rituals can bind one, and Bhagavan was very particular about breaking every one of the ties binding his disciples. Is this not a sure sign of Bhagavan's extraordinary concern for his disciples? Once, Bhagavan was talking to Muruganar about certain books. Muruganar was giving Bhagavan a detailed account of the contents of each of these books. After listening attentively to all these particulars, Bhagavan remarked, "Ultimately, all these books are saying the same thing. Only the descriptions and illustrations differ from one book to the other. The routes might differ, but the destination is the same." Muruganar readily agreed, saying, "Yes, that is true. After reading all these books, we feel that it has been a waste of time." Bhagavan replied, "But unless you read the books, how can you get to know that they are all saying the same thing? Until you read them, there would always be the tantalizing thought that there might be some new revelation in one book or the other. Only when you have read them can you feel certain that there is nothing to be gained from studying them. This is like saying that one has to perform rituals before one can truly appreciate the fact that rituals are not needed, or that only through engaging oneself in various forms of worship one can get to know that performing puja is not very important for spiritual realization.